and to Victoria and our 6.7 million friends. You're meant to get excited about 5 deaths and 14 new cases in Victoria at the weekend. Taking a look at the rolling 14-day case average, the key metric used by the Victorian government to map its path out of lockdown, it's dropped to 34.4 in metropolitan Melbourne. That number drops to just 1.6 in regional Victoria. Please don't start giving Daniel Andrews credit for turning it around, or allegedly. The real question is, how much should Daniel Andrews be smashed for allowing this virus to spread? Only the most rusted on Labor supporters could thank Andrews for what he's done. As the Federal Assistant Treasurer Michael Sukkar, a Victorian, said appropriately yesterday, the social and economic devastation in Victoria needs to be urgently addressed. And I quote his words, with 14 new cases yesterday, covering up the mistakes of the past needs to stop. He said now is the time to significantly ease restrictions before even more irreparable damage is done to Victoria. And he's right, irreparable damage. And then we hear that only 2 nurses were on duty to manage 110 residents at Melbourne's Epping Gardens nursing home when the Australian Defence Force personnel arrived to take control of the coronavirus hit aged care facility. Now, no staff on the night shift were familiar with the nursing home or any of its residents. Can you believe this? The Defence staff were called in on July 27 after more than 70 residents were diagnosed with coronavirus. The centre has since been linked to 218 cases and 35 deaths. Epping Gardens is the nation's worst affected nursing home. 2 nurses on duty to manage 110 residents. Seriously, for God's sake, sack someone. It's beyond scandalous. And I've said from day one, everyone knew who the vulnerable were, the aged, the elderly, and those with preconditions, but still, no politician has uttered the fact that 99% of the cases are mild and 99.75% of the cases recover. And as for lockdowns, now in the top 10 countries for COVID-19 deaths per million people, Peru, Belgium, Spain, Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, the UK, the US and Italy, top 10. Brazil is the only non-lockdown country. So much for the lockdown theory. Victoria has ended up with 90% of Australia's COVID deaths. The average age of all coronavirus deaths in Australia is 83. Is this a pandemic? The government's own health department shows total deaths in aged care across Australia were down almost 1,000 in the first 7 months of 2020 compared with 2019. Aged care deaths were down 1,000. Worldwide, 9 months into this so-called pandemic, there have been nearly 1 million deaths. If we had politicians, our supposed leaders, talking about the Spanish flu, well, there were 1.8 billion people in the world then, and the Spanish flu recorded 50 to 100 million deaths. There are now 7.7 billion people in the world. We would have had to have recorded 210 million deaths. We haven't yet reached 1 million. And over 60 million people die in the world every year. In the world, as I speak to you today, there are 61,000 cases which are serious. In Australia, there are 10. But lockdowns are everywhere in every state. As Chris Mitchell says in today's Australian, the threats to life of the coronavirus have been wildly exaggerated, especially in the media. But as you face lockdowns everywhere and restrictions, remember, the Oxford University Professor of Epidemiology, Sunetra Gupta, says there is no way a lockdown can eliminate the virus. And as Professor Ramesh Thakur wrote recently, the Swedish example teaches us 3 important lessons. First, be open and transparent, not dogmatic and totalitarian. Second, provide clear guidance to the people, including the limits of scientific certainty. And finally, this is the great point, transfer the responsibility for risk assessment and management back to the people. They are the ones best placed to make informed choices that directly affect their lives and livelihoods today and into the future. But nonetheless, totalitarian behaviour prevails. New South Wales Rugby League has these young kids, aged 9, and they get excited, don't they? They can't shake hands. They can't sing the team song. They can't involve themselves in any medal presentation. And no one can tell them why. Not one shred of evidence to justify any of that. I see Alan Joyce, to his credit, is taking a major pay cut, an 83% cut, as are a lot of other businesses. But the Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg has said companies, quote, should act in line with community sentiment. He said ultimately executives and boards are accountable to their shareholders, and while it's up to them to decide how much they would pay their staff and how they distribute their dividends, they need to be mindful of community expectations. Josh, if you are mindful of community expectations, why don't you take an 83% cut in your pay, just as the Qantas chief has done? No. Federal MPs and staff may be forced to quarantine while they're in the ACT because they'll return to Canberra next week. There's a sitting week in October. They'll remain there for up to 12 weeks. But the taxpayer, you will pick up the bill for their quarantine. If you, a dreary Australian returning home, and you're quarantined for 2 weeks, you'll pay $3,000 to $4,000 of your own money in a quarantine hotel. Now, MPs and staff will qualify for $291 a night travel allowance to stay in Canberra, whether Parliament is sitting or not. That's about $2,300 a week. 2 weeks quarantine, nearly $5,000, paid for by you. You're giving them this money every night. And if they arrive in Canberra on Sunday and stay until the final sitting week in December, they'll get more than $20,000 each. They'll get it, be given it. Digest that. Josh Frydenberg's talking about community expectations. And the New Zealand Prime Minister goes to an election next month. Good evening to my friends in New Zealand. The economy has contracted by a record 12.2% in 3 months. She was in the draconian lockdown mode. As the Kiwi Bank chief economist Jared Kerr said, we've never seen anything like it. Jacinda Ardern, of course, thought she could totally eliminate the virus. The lockdowns were amongst the toughest in the world. It's not only opposition accusations in New Zealand which are saying that these things have pushed the New Zealand economy off the cliff. 12.2% contraction of the New Zealand economy in 3 months. And as you heard Andrew say earlier tonight, the prestigious Archibald Portrait Prize will be announced on Friday. Now, I want you to check out the finalists. Check them out. See how many lefties get a Guernsey. What do we say about the march through institutions? It's very real.